Welcome to Snooze Stories. Tonight, we journey to ancient China, to a time when kingdoms rose and fell like autumn leaves, when the old order crumbled and the future seemed uncertain. We travel back more than 2,500 years to meet a man who would change the course of human thought, not through conquest, not through wealth, but through the quiet power of wisdom. His name was Confucius, though history would come to know him as Confucius. Before we begin, if you enjoy these historical stories, please subscribe right now and help this channel to grow. Every subscriber genuinely makes a difference for a new channel like this, and the like button pushes this video to more people who want to hear stories like these. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures whose stories you'd like to hear, leave a comment below. Now, settle into your pillows. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow yourself to drift as we walk together through the mist-covered hills of ancient China, through bamboo groves and stone courtyards, through a life that began in poverty and ended in legacy. Confucius was not born a sage. He was not destined from birth to become one of history's most influential thinkers. He was born into hardship, raised in uncertainty, and spent much of his life searching for a way to heal a broken world, searching for truth in ancient texts, searching for a ruler who would listen to his vision of harmony and virtue. He failed in many ways. He never found that ideal ruler. He never saw his political dreams realized. He spent years wandering from state to state, often hungry, sometimes in danger, rejected more often than welcomed. And yet, in that failure, he discovered something far more enduring than political power. He discovered principles that would shape civilizations. He taught that goodness could be cultivated, that ritual and music could refine the human heart, that respect for family and tradition could bind society together. He believed that anyone, regardless of birth, could become noble through learning and moral effort. Tonight, we will follow him from his birth in a small village to his death as an old man surrounded by devoted students. We will walk with him through his years of teaching, through his brief moment in government, through his long exile, and finally, through his return home. We will see him not as a marble statue in a temple, but as a man, stubborn, idealistic, sometimes frustrated, often weary, but never willing to abandon his vision of what humanity could become. The China of his time was fragmenting. The old ways were dying. Violence and ambition ruled the day. Into this chaos came a minor official's son with an impossible dream that virtue, not force, could govern the world. Let us see how that dream unfolded. Let us meet Confucius. To understand Confucius, we must first understand the world that shaped him, a world of fading glory and rising chaos, of ancient traditions crumbling beneath the weight of ambition and war. Picture China in the 6th century before the Common Era. The land was not yet unified under a single empire. Instead, it was a patchwork of competing states, each ruled by lords who owed nominal allegiance to the Zhou dynasty, but who increasingly acted as independent powers. This era would come to be known as the Spring and Autumn period, named for the chronicle that would later record its tumultuous events, a chronicle that Confucius himself would help to edit. The Zhou dynasty had once been glorious. Centuries earlier, around 1046 BCE, the Zhou people had overthrown the Shang dynasty and established a new order. They claimed a divine mandate, the mandate of heaven, which held that the right to rule came from the heavens themselves and could be withdrawn if a ruler became corrupt or incompetent. It was a revolutionary idea that kingship was not absolute, but conditional upon virtue. For generations, the Zhou system had worked. The king ruled from his capital and appointed relatives and loyal nobles to govern territories throughout the realm. These nobles, in turn, swore fealty to the king and provided him with soldiers and tribute. It was a feudal structure, held together by ritual, kinship, and the threat of force. But by the time of Confucius's birth in 551 BCE, this system had long since begun to unravel. The Zhou kings had become figureheads, honored in ceremony but powerless in practice. The real authority lay with the lords of the various states, men who commanded armies, controlled territory, and made their own laws. Some of these states were large and powerful: Qi in the east, Jin in the north, Chu in the south, Qin in the west. Others were smaller, caught between their stronger neighbors, constantly threatened by absorption or destruction. The state of Lu, where Confucius would be born, was one of these smaller states. It lay in what is now Shandong province, a region of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and the sacred mountain Taishan. Lu was considered culturally important because it had been granted to the Duke of Lu, the brother of the dynasty's founder, a man renowned for his wisdom and virtue. The people of Lu prided themselves on preserving the old rituals and traditions more faithfully than other states. But preservation of tradition could not protect them from the realities of power. Lu was surrounded by larger, more aggressive neighbors. Its rulers were often weak, its court riven by intrigue, its policies dictated as much by the great families within the state as by the duke himself. This was the pattern everywhere. The old bonds of loyalty were fraying. Lords overthrew their rulers. Ministers usurped their lords. Powerful families within states became more influential than the nominal sovereigns. Warfare became constant, not the ritualized battles of earlier times, where armies would meet at appointed places and fight according to established rules, but brutal campaigns of conquest and annexation. The philosophers of later generations would look back on this period and see it as a time when the way, the Tao, had been lost. The ancient sages, they believed, had known how to live in harmony with heaven and earth, how to govern with virtue rather than force, how to maintain peace through ritual and music. But that knowledge had been forgotten. The world had descended into disorder. And yet, paradoxically, this chaos also produced extraordinary creativity. When the old certainties collapse, people began to ask fundamental questions. What is the right way to live? What makes a government legitimate? What are the foundations of human society? How can we restore order without perpetuating violence? These questions obsessed the intellectuals of the time. Scholars traveled from state to state, offering their services and their ideas to any lord who would listen. Some advocated for strict laws and harsh punishments. Others promoted mysticism and withdrawal from worldly affairs. Still others believed in the power of strategic thinking and military strength. Into this ferment of ideas, Confucius would eventually add his voice, but his vision would be different. He would look backward to the golden age of the early Zhou dynasty and argue that the solution to contemporary problems lay in recovering ancient wisdom. He would insist that ritual, propriety, and education could transform both individuals and society. He would teach that the key to good government was the moral cultivation of rulers. These ideas would seem hopelessly idealistic to many of his contemporaries. After all, what use was virtue in a world governed by swords? What lord would choose ritual over military advantage? What ambitious minister would limit his own power for the sake of abstract principles? And yet, Confucius would persist. He would spend his entire life trying to convince someone, anyone, that there was another way, that humanity did not have to choose between chaos and tyranny, that the old traditions contained wisdom that could heal a broken world. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 551 BCE, when Confucius was born, these ideas did not yet exist. He was simply a baby, born into poverty in a small town in a minor state, in a world that seemed to be falling apart. The Zhou kings still sat on their throne, maintaining the rituals even though they commanded no armies. The lords still paid them nominal respect, even as they warred with each other for territory and power. The old families still claimed descent from ancient heroes, even as they schemed against each other for influence and wealth. Everyone could see that the system was broken, but no one yet knew how to fix it. The farmers in the fields planted their crops and hoped the armies would pass them by. The merchants in the towns tried to profit from the chaos while avoiding the wrong side of any conflict. The scholars in the courts debated policy and hoped their advice would be heeded. The soldiers sharpened their weapons and waited for the next campaign. It was a world of uncertainty and danger, but also of possibility. A world where traditional answers no longer sufficed, where new ideas could find an audience, where a poor boy with a brilliant mind might, just possibly, change the course of history. This was the world into which Confucius, was born. A world that desperately needed what he would spend his life trying to give it, a vision of human dignity, social harmony, and moral order. A world that would largely reject him during his lifetime, but would eventually embrace his teachings for millennia to come. Let us now meet the child who would become the sage. In the autumn of 551 BCE, in the small town of Zhao, near the city of Khufu in the state of Lu, a child was born who would change the world. His family named him Kong Q. History would add honorifics and titles, transforming his name into Kong Fuzi, Master Kong, which would be Latinized centuries later by Jesuit missionaries as Confucius. But on that autumn day, he was simply a baby, born into a family that had seen better days, in a modest house far removed from the centers of power. His father was named Kong He, sometimes called Shuliang He. Kong He was already an old man when his son was born. Some accounts say he was 70 years old, though the exact age is lost to time. What we know is that he was a minor military officer, a man of some local standing but little wealth. He belonged to the Shi class, the lowest rank of the nobility, men who were technically aristocrats but who often lived lives barely distinguishable from commoners. Kong He had been a warrior in his youth. Stories would later tell of his great strength, of how he once held up a falling city gate with his own arms so that his comrades could escape. Whether true or embellished, such tales spoke to his reputation as a man of physical prowess and courage. But courage did not translate into prosperity, and by the time of his son's birth, Kong He's best years were behind him. He had been married before. His first wife had given him 9 daughters, but no sons, or perhaps one son who was disabled and could not perform the ancestral rites that were so crucial to family continuity. In the patriarchal society of ancient China, this was a crisis. Without a healthy son, the family line would end. The ancestral tablets would go untended. The rituals that connected the living to the dead would cease. So Kong He took a second wife, or perhaps a concubine. The historical record is unclear and conflicting. Her name was Yan Zhangzai, and she was very young, perhaps only 15 or 16 years old when she married the elderly Kong He. She came from the Yan clan, a respectable family, but the union was unusual enough that later sources would describe it as a wild union, meaning irregular, perhaps hasty, certainly not arranged through the usual elaborate courtship rituals. Some scholars believe the family made a pilgrimage to Mount Ni, a sacred hill near their home, to pray for a son. Whether through prayer or simply the course of nature, Yan Zhangzai became pregnant and, in due course, gave birth to a boy. They named him Q, which means hill, possibly in reference to Mount Ni, or perhaps because the child was born with an unusual indentation at the top of his head, a slight hollow that resembled a hilltop with a depression in its center. Such physical peculiarities were often seen as signs of what no one could say. But the child was healthy and male, and that was what mattered most. Kong He must have felt profound relief. He had his heir. The family line would continue. The ancestors would be honored. But that relief was short-lived. When the boy Q was only 3 years old, his father died. Imagine the child's earliest memory. Perhaps a house full of mourning, the sound of ritual wailing, the smell of incense burning before the ancestral tablets, his mother's tear-stained face, the feeling that something enormous and incomprehensible had happened, that the world had suddenly become a colder, more uncertain place. His father's death left the family in a precarious position. Yan Chengzai was still very young, perhaps only 18 or 19, suddenly alone with a small child. Kong He's property and position passed not to her and her son, but to his first family, the grown daughters and perhaps the disabled son from his first marriage. Custom and law gave them priority. The young widow and her toddler were effectively displaced. Whether that was open hostility or merely cold indifference, we cannot know, but young Q and his mother found themselves living in poverty, dependent on the charity of relatives, occupying the margins of a family that barely acknowledged them. They may have moved to Khufu itself, seeking opportunities in the larger town, living in a small house in a modest neighborhood. This early experience of loss and displacement would mark Confucius for life. He would grow up knowing that he was technically of noble birth. The Kong family could trace its lineage back to the nobility of the Shang dynasty, but in practice he lived like a commoner. He understood both worlds, belonged fully to neither, and perhaps that marginal position gave him a unique perspective on society and its structures. His mother became the central figure of his childhood. Yan Chengcai was determined that her son would not remain in poverty and obscurity. She could not give him wealth, but she could give him something more valuable: education. Even in their reduced circumstances, she made sure the boy learned to read and write, skills that were far from universal even among the nobility. Young Q proved to be a remarkable student. He was curious about everything, asking endless questions, wanting to understand how things worked and why they were done in particular ways. He was especially fascinated by ritual and ceremony. While other children played games, he would arrange sacrificial vessels, or objects that stood in for them, and practice the elaborate movements and recitations of ancestral rites. His neighbors might have found this strange, this solemn child performing adult ceremonies, but his mother encouraged him. She understood that in a world where they had no material advantages, knowledge and propriety might be their way forward. If her son could master the ancient rituals, if he could demonstrate learning and cultivation, he might attract the attention of someone influential. He might find a position, a patron, a path out of poverty. The streets of Khufu became the boy's classroom. He watched the ceremonies at the local temples, memorizing the gestures and words. He listened to the stories that traveling musicians and storytellers told about the ancient sage kings, Yao and Shun, the Duke of Zhou, the founders of civilization who had ruled with perfect virtue. These were not just entertainment, they were lessons in how the world ought to be, a vision of an ordered, harmonious society where everyone knew their place and performed their duties with grace and precision. He also learned the harsh realities of his present world. He saw the arrogance of the wealthy and powerful, the suffering of the poor, the way that might often triumphed over right. He experienced himself the sting of being looked down upon, of having noble lineage but no noble fortune, of being simultaneously insider and outsider. These experiences could have made him bitter, cynical, resentful. Instead, they seemed to fuel his determination to understand and master the traditional forms. If the present was chaotic and unjust, perhaps the answer lay in recovering the wisdom of the past. If society had lost its way, perhaps studying the ancient rituals and texts could show the path back to order and goodness.
He was not yet 7 years old, but already the patterns of his future thought were forming. Already he was becoming the person who would dedicate his life to learning, teaching, and trying to restore what he believed had been lost. His mother must have watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride at her son's obvious intelligence and dedication, anxiety about what the future held for a poor boy with grand aspirations in a world that valued power and wealth above learning and virtue. She could not have imagined how far her son would travel, how many students would seek his teaching, how profoundly his ideas would shape not just Lu, not just China, but human civilization itself. She only knew that he was special, that he had gifts that must be cultivated, that despite their poverty, he must not be allowed to waste his potential. And so she sacrificed for his education. In a society where most children, even of the nobility, received only the most basic instruction, young Chu studied deeply. He learned the classic texts, or what portions of them he could access. He practiced calligraphy until his characters were graceful and precise. He studied music, learning to play the qin, the seven-stringed zither that was considered essential to a gentleman's education. He practiced archery and learned the rudiments of chariot driving, the traditional arts of the nobility, even though he had no chariot and little prospect of ever commanding one. When he was 7 or 8, his mother took him to the local school, not a grand academy, but a modest place where the children of minor officials and aspiring families gathered to learn. Here he studied under a teacher whose name has been lost to history, but whose impact must have been significant. He learned the odes, the ancient poetry that was used to teach history, morality, and proper feeling. He learned the rituals that governed everything from ancestral worship to court ceremonies. He learned the importance of li, propriety, ritual, the correct way of doing things, which would become central to his later teaching. But perhaps more importantly, he learned to think. His teachers noticed that he did not simply memorize, he questioned, analyzed, connected ideas. He wanted to know not just what the rituals were, but why they mattered, what they meant, how they shaped human character and social order. Some teachers might have found such questioning impertinent, but in the intellectual ferment of the spring and autumn period, when old certainties were crumbling and new ideas were desperately needed, a brilliant and curious mind was recognized as valuable. Young Chu was serious beyond his years, intense, driven by something his peers did not share. While other boys thought about games and adventures, he thought about the meaning of ceremony, the nature of goodness, the principles that ought to govern human relationships. This could have made him unpopular, but somehow it didn't. There was something about his sincerity, his obvious devotion to learning, that inspired respect even in those who did not share his interests. He was not perfect, of course. No child is. He could be stubborn, insistent on doing things the right way, even when easier paths were available. He could be impatient with those who did not take ritual and learning as seriously as he did. He had the intensity of the gifted child who sees possibilities that others miss and who cannot understand why everyone else doesn't see them too. But he was also capable of great warmth, especially towards those who showed genuine interest in learning. He would explain things patiently, demonstrate rituals carefully, share what he had learned with anyone who would listen. Already in these early years, he was beginning to discover his calling as a teacher.
The years of his childhood passed in this way. Study, practice, more study, gradual mastery of the forms and texts that comprised a gentleman's education. His mother watched him grow from a small child into a youth, saw his mind sharpen and his knowledge deepen, and must have felt that her sacrifices had been worthwhile. But she also must have worried. Learning was all very well, but how would it translate into survival? How would this serious, idealistic boy make his way in a world that valued power above principle? What future could there be for a poor scholar, no matter how brilliant, in the cutthroat politics of the spring and autumn period? These questions hung over the household as Chu approached adolescence. His education was impressive, but education alone would not feed him. He would need to find work, to establish himself, to build a life. He was still the son of a minor noble family, still technically of the she class, but without wealth or powerful connections, that status meant little. He would have to make his own way, relying on his abilities rather than inherited advantage. At 15 or 16, he began to work, not in any grand position, but in humble roles, keeping accounts for a granary, supervising livestock, managing the practical details of local administration. These were not the positions he dreamed of, but they were honest work, and he performed them with the same conscientiousness he brought to his studies. He did not complain about these menial tasks. Instead, he approached them as opportunities to learn. How was grain measured and stored? How were animals managed? How did local government actually function at its most basic level? Every job was a classroom, every experience a lesson. His mother had taught him well. She had shown him that dignity was not a matter of position, but of character, that nobility was something you demonstrated through your actions, not something you inherited. She had given him both the tools to rise and the resilience to endure. And as he moved into young adulthood, carrying with him the learning she had helped him acquire and the moral vision that was already taking shape in his mind, Kong Chu, soon to be known as Master Kong, Confucius, was preparing to step onto the larger stage of history. But first, he would need to navigate the challenges of early adulthood, marriage, family, livelihood, and the slow, difficult process of establishing himself as someone worth listening to in a world that rarely listened to poor scholars with idealistic visions. Those challenges lay just ahead. For now, in his late teens, he was still learning, still growing, still becoming the person who would eventually teach thousands and influence billions. The child who had practiced rituals with makeshift vessels was becoming a man who would dedicate his life to understanding what those rituals truly meant and why they mattered more than armies or gold. At 19, Kong Qiu married. It was expected, this step into adulthood. A man needed a household, needed sons to continue the family line and perform the ancestral rites. His mother, Yan Zhengcai, despite their poverty, arranged a suitable match. The bride's family name was Qiguan, and though we know almost nothing else about her, not even her personal name as was common for women of that era, we know that she came from a respectable family and that the marriage followed proper forms. It was not, perhaps, a love match in the romantic sense, but neither was it cold or merely transactional. The young couple established a household together, modest though it was, and within the first year they had a son. Kong Qiu named him Li, which means carp, because on the day of the boy's birth, the Duke of Lu sent a gift of carp to honor the occasion. It was a small gesture from the ruler, acknowledging Kong Qiu's minor noble status, but it meant enough that he commemorated it in his son's name. Later, they would have daughters as well, though their names and fates have been lost to history, as happens so often with women in ancient records. Marriage and fatherhood brought new responsibilities and new pressures. A family needed income, needed stability. Kong Qiu could not live on learning alone, no matter how deep his knowledge of the ancient texts. He needed work, and in his early 20s, he took whatever positions were available to someone of his station and abilities. He became a keeper of stores, managing a granary, responsible for measuring grain that came in from the fields and ensuring it was properly distributed. It was meticulous work, requiring careful record-keeping and absolute honesty. He later remembered this time, saying simply, "When I was in charge of stores, my accounting was accurate." There was no drama in it, no glory, but there was integrity. He did the work properly because that was the only way he knew how to do anything. Later, he supervised livestock for a local noble family, managing pastures and herds. Again, humble work, but he approached it seriously. "When I was in charge of parks and herds," he would recall, "the animals multiplied." He learned about careful management, about attention to cycles and seasons, about the patience required to nurture growth. These jobs were far from his aspirations. He was a scholar working as a clerk, a student of ritual employed as a shepherd. But he did not waste these years. Every experience taught him something. The granary showed him how local administration functioned, how resources were gathered and distributed, how easy it would be for a dishonest official to skim from the stores while the poor went hungry. The pastures taught him about stewardship, about responsibility for what was entrusted to his care. And in every spare moment, he studied. His formal education had given him a foundation, but now he took charge of his own learning. He sought out whatever texts he could find, borrowed or copied manuscripts, memorized the odes and documents, studied the rituals in minute detail. The state of Lu, because of its connection to the Duke of Zhou, prided itself on preserving the ancient traditions more faithfully than other states. Kong Qiu took advantage of this, observing ceremonies at the court whenever possible, asking questions of anyone who might know the proper forms. He became known as someone obsessed with correctness, with getting the details exactly right. not out of pedantry, but out of a growing conviction that these forms mattered profoundly. The rituals were not empty gestures, they were the accumulated wisdom of generations, ways of channeling human emotions and relationships into harmonious patterns. When performed correctly and sincerely, they cultivated virtue. When neglected or corrupted, society itself became disordered. This was becoming the core of his emerging philosophy, that human nature could be refined and perfected through education and practice, that the old rituals contained psychological and social truths, that the path to a good society lay not in radical innovation, but in recovering and living out ancient wisdom. He was developing his ideas in relative isolation, not yet a teacher with students, just a young man working humble jobs and thinking deeply about the great questions. What makes a person good? What makes a government legitimate? Why had the present age fallen into such disorder? How could the world return to the harmony that the ancient sages had supposedly achieved? The answers he was forming would have seemed old-fashioned to many of his contemporaries. The age was moving toward legalism, toward the idea that strict laws and harsh punishments could force people to behave correctly, or toward military pragmatism, the belief that power was the only thing that mattered. Some thinkers were already exploring mystical ideas about aligning with the natural way of things and abandoning human striving altogether. Kong Kui was swimming against all these currents. He believed in human effort, in moral cultivation, in the power of education and ritual to transform character. He believed that anyone could become noble, not through birth, but through learning and practice. He believed that governance should be based on virtue, that a ruler's example mattered more than his laws, that a society organized according to proper ritual and sincere benevolence could achieve peace without the need for constant force. These were radical ideas in their own way, though they were dressed in conservative language. He was saying that birth did not determine worth, that the old hierarchies should be based on merit and virtue rather than mere inheritance. He was saying that education should be available to anyone willing to learn, not just the wealthy and well-born. These were not the thoughts of someone trying to preserve privilege. They were the thoughts of someone who had experienced both nobility and poverty and believed there was a better way to organize human society. But he was still just one poor scholar among many, unknown beyond his immediate circle, earning his living through routine work while his mind wrestled with these large questions. And then, in 527 BCE, when Kong Kui was 24 years old, his mother died. The loss shattered him. Yan Zhengzai had been the constant presence of his life, his teacher and supporter, the one who had believed in him when there was little reason to believe, who had sacrificed to give him an education, who had never stopped hoping that her son would find a way to rise above their circumstances. Now she was gone, and he was alone with his grief. In ancient China, filial piety, devotion to one's parents, was considered the foundation of all other virtues. A person who did not honor their parents could not be trusted to honor anyone else, and so there were elaborate rules governing mourning, especially mourning for one's parents. Kong Chu, who had spent years studying these rituals, now had to live them. The mourning period for a parent was 3 years, not quite 3 full years, but actually 25 or 27 months, the period during which a child is completely dependent on parental care. The symbolism was that the child was repaying in mourning what the parent had given in nurture. During this time, a person was expected to withdraw from public life, to live simply, to abstain from music and pleasure, to focus entirely on grief and remembrance. For someone in a government position, this meant resigning. For someone as poor as Kong Chu, it meant even greater hardship because mourning prevented him from working. But he did not hesitate. He conducted his mother's funeral with scrupulous attention to every detail, performing each ritual exactly as it should be performed. He built a simple shelter near her grave and lived there, keeping vigil. He dressed in rough mourning garments. He ate plain food, just enough to sustain life. He withdrew from the world. There was a problem, though. Kong Chu did not know where his father was buried. Kong He had died when his son was only 3, and in the displacement that followed, the location of his grave had been lost, or perhaps never told to the young widow and her child. Kong Chu wanted to bury his mother beside his father, as was proper, but he did not know where to find him. He had to ask around, had to search, had to piece together information from people who had known his father. Eventually, he found the place, or a place he believed was correct, and was able to bury his mother properly. This incident reveals something important about his circumstances. He was so marginal to his father's family that no one had even told him where his father was buried. The sense of displacement, of being an outsider, even in his own family, must have been profound. But it also reveals his character. He did not simply give up or make do with a separate burial. He searched until he found what he needed to do things properly. This was the man he was becoming, someone who believed that forms mattered, that doing things correctly was worth whatever effort it required. The 3 years of mourning were years of transformation. In his grief and solitude, Kong Chu had time to think more deeply than ever before. He was approaching 30 now, the age that he would later describe as the time when he stood firm in his convictions. The years of study and work, of marriage and fatherhood, of learning both the ancient texts and the practical realities of life, all of this was crystallizing into a coherent vision. He emerged from mourning a changed man, not in his basic character, but in his sense of purpose. He had always been serious, studious, devoted to learning. Now he understood what he wanted to do with that learning. He wanted to teach, not just to accumulate knowledge for himself, but to pass it on, to help others understand what he had come to understand about virtue and ritual, about how to live a good life and create a good society. He believed that education could transform people, that learning was not just memorization, but moral cultivation, that anyone willing to make the effort could become better, nobler, more fully human. He was still poor. He still had no powerful patrons or official position, but he had something more valuable: clarity of purpose and deep knowledge earned through years of dedicated study. And so, as he left the mourning period behind and returned to the world, Kong Kui began, quietly and modestly, to teach anyone who would listen. He did not open a grand academy. He simply let it be known that he was willing to accept students, that anyone who brought a small gift, even just a bundle of dried meat, the minimum token of respect, could study with him. He did not care about their social class or family background. He cared only whether they were sincere, whether they genuinely wanted to learn. This was revolutionary. Education had always been largely restricted to the nobility. Now, here was a poor scholar saying that virtue and learning were available to anyone, that nobility of character mattered more than nobility of birth. His first students were probably young men from modest backgrounds like his own, people who could not afford the established teachers, but who hungered for knowledge and self-improvement. He taught them the odes and the rituals, the history of the ancient sage kings, the principles of proper conduct. But he also taught them by example, showing them what it meant to pursue learning for its own sake, to care about doing things correctly even when no one was watching, to believe that a better world was possible if people would only commit to moral cultivation. He was 30 years old, or close to it. He had survived poverty, loss, and years of obscurity. He had educated himself, mastered the ancient traditions, developed a coherent philosophy of life and society. Now, finally, he was ready to share what he had learned, ready to begin the work that would define his life and, though he could not have known it then, transform human civilization. The teacher had emerged from years of preparation. The students were beginning to gather. The teaching that would become Confucianism was about to begin. But first, he would have one more chance to put his ideas into practice in the world of politics and government. That opportunity and the disillusionment that would follow lay just ahead. The word spread quietly at first, passing through the modest neighborhoods of Khufu like a rumor or a secret. There was a man, Confucius, who would teach anyone willing to learn. Not just the sons of nobles, not just the wealthy who could afford expensive tutors, but anyone who came with sincerity and a humble gift. It was an audacious idea, almost unheard of. Education had always been a privilege, a marker of status, something that separated the ruling class from the common people. The knowledge of ritual, the ability to read and interpret the ancient texts, the cultivation of music and ceremony, these were the tools of power, jealously guarded by those who possessed them. But Confucius saw it differently. He had come to believe that human nature itself was fundamentally similar across all people, that the capacity for goodness and wisdom was not the exclusive property of the aristocracy. Yes, people were born into different circumstances, with different advantages, but the ability to learn, to grow morally, to cultivate virtue, this was universal. In education, there are no class distinctions, he would say. It was one of his most radical statements, though he delivered it calmly, as if it were simply obvious truth. His first students came hesitantly, uncertain what to expect. Some were young men from poor families, sons of merchants or minor officials, people who saw in education their only path to advancement. Others were slightly older, perhaps already working in low-level positions, but hungry for something more than their daily routines. A few came from better circumstances, drawn by reports of Confucius' extraordinary learning and his reputation for correctness in ritual matters. Confucius received them all. His only requirement was the symbolic gift, a bundle of dried meat, worth very little, but representing respect and commitment. This was not about making money. It was about ensuring that the student took the relationship seriously, that learning was understood as something valuable, something that required effort and dedication. He taught in his home at first, in a courtyard where students could gather. Later, as numbers grew, they might meet in other spaces, under trees, in temple courtyards, anywhere conducive to conversation and study. The setting mattered less than the interaction. His teaching method was unlike anything his students had experienced. He did not simply lecture, pouring information into passive recipients. Instead, he questioned, probed, drew out his students' own thoughts. He believed that true understanding came not from memorization, but from active engagement with ideas. I do not open up the truth to one who is not eager to get knowledge, nor help out anyone who is not anxious to explain himself. When I have presented one corner of a subject and the student cannot from it learn the other three, I do not repeat my lesson. This sounds harsh, perhaps, but it was born of respect. He believed his students were capable of thinking, of making connections, of working things out for themselves. His job was not to fill their heads with facts, but to spark their understanding, to guide them toward insight. A student might ask about benevolence, Ren, the highest virtue in Confucius' system, a word that meant something like humaneness, goodness, care for others. Different students received different answers because Confucius tailored his teaching to what each person needed to hear. To one, he might say, "It is to love people." To another, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself." To a third, "Wishing to establish oneself, one establishes others. Wishing to enlarge oneself, one enlarges others." The same principle, approached from different angles, meeting students where they were in their understanding. He taught through the ancient texts, especially the Book of Odes, the collection of poems and songs that formed the foundation of classical education. But he did not treat them as mere literature. For him, they were guides to proper feeling and moral understanding. A poem about a faithful wife was a lesson in loyalty. A song about laborers in the field was a lesson in the dignity of work and the responsibility of rulers to care for their people. Every verse could be mined for ethical insight. "My young friends," he would say, "why do you not study the odes? They will help you be more apt in your speech, more observant of phenomena. They teach you about serving your father and your prince. You learn from them the names of many birds, animals, plants, and trees." But beyond the content, what his students found most remarkable was his passion. Kong Chu cared about these old texts, these ancient rituals, these questions of virtue and character with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. When he spoke about the Duke of Zhou, that paragon of virtue from the early Zhou dynasty, his voice would fill with emotion. The Duke had established the rituals, had governed with wisdom and humility, had embodied everything a noble person should be. "How greatly has my strength declined," Kong Chu once lamented. "It has been long since I dreamed of the Duke of Zhou." For him, even dreams were markers of spiritual connection or decline. The fact that he no longer dreamed of the ancient sage meant his own virtue was slipping, his connection to that golden age weakening. His students must have found this strange at times, this elderly scholar, he was in his 30s and 40s during these years, which was considered approaching old age in that era, who spoke of long-dead rulers as if they were personal friends, who wept over ancient ceremonies, who believed with absolute conviction that the key to fixing a broken world lay in recovering the wisdom of the past. But they also felt the force of his sincerity. He was not teaching for personal gain or empty reputation. He genuinely believed that what he was sharing could transform lives and society. He lived according to his own principles, demonstrating through his daily conduct what he taught in words. He was meticulous about ritual, yes, but not in a cold or mechanical way. He understood that ritual was meant to express genuine feeling, to shape and channel emotion rather than suppress it. When entering a palace gate, he would bow as if the space were too small to admit him standing upright, a gesture of respect and humility. When passing the empty throne, even if the ruler was not present, he would quicken his pace and adopt a serious expression, acknowledging the dignity of the position even in absence. These were not empty gestures to him. They were ways of cultivating reverence, of training oneself to recognize and honor what deserved honor. By practicing correct forms, one developed correct attitudes. The outer shaped the inner, and the inner gave meaning to the outer. His students learned through observation as much as instruction. They watched how he interacted with people of different ranks, always appropriate but never servile. They saw how he responded to questions, never pretending to know what he did not know. When you know a thing, to recognize that you know it, and when you do not, to recognize that you do not. This is knowledge, he told them. They noticed his love of music. He played the qin, the elegant seven-stringed zither, and he sang the old songs with feeling. Once, hearing a particularly beautiful piece of ancient music, he was so moved that he could not taste meat for 3 months afterward. "I did not imagine that music could reach such perfection," he said, awed by beauty that connected him across centuries to the ancient masters who had composed it. Music, for Kong Chu, was not mere entertainment. It was moral education, a way of harmonizing the soul, of aligning human emotions with cosmic order. A society with proper music would be a society with proper feelings, with people moved by the right things in the right ways. As his reputation grew, his student body diversified. Some came from the state of Lu itself, but others traveled from neighboring states, willing to leave home to study with this remarkable teacher. Young men who would later become famous in their own right, though their names are lost to all but specialists now, sat at his feet, debated with him, absorbed his teachings, and made them their own. He had favorites, though he tried not to show it too obviously. There was Yan Hui, called Yan Yuan, a young man of exceptional promise from a very poor family. Yan Hui lived on a bowl of rice and a gourd of water in a mean alley, circumstances that would have made others miserable, but he remained cheerful and devoted to learning. Admirable indeed is Yan Hui, Kong Chu would exclaim. In Yan Hui he saw the proof of his philosophy, that virtue did not depend on wealth or comfort, that a person could be supremely noble while living in poverty. There was Zilu, brave and impulsive, a former warrior who sometimes challenged his teacher, who acted first and thought later, but whose loyalty was absolute. Kong Chu appreciated Zilu's honesty even when it bordered on bluntness. He tried to temper the young man's impetuosity with reflection, but he also valued his courage and directness. There was Zigong, clever and eloquent, good at debate, successful in commerce. Kong Chu once compared his students to different types of vessels, some better suited to one purpose, some to another. Each had his own character, his own strengths and weaknesses, and Kong Chu tried to help each become the best version of himself. The teaching was not one-directional. Kong Chu learned from his students too, refined his ideas through their questions and challenges. When they failed to understand something, he looked for better ways to explain it. When they pointed out inconsistencies or difficulties, he thought more deeply about the problems. He was developing a comprehensive vision of human life and society. At its center was Ren, benevolence, humaneness, the quality of caring genuinely about others and acting on that care. This was the highest virtue, the one that encompassed all others. Supporting Ren was Li, ritual, propriety, the correct forms of behavior in all situations. Li was not rigid formalism, but the accumulated wisdom about how to conduct relationships, how to express respect and care, how to maintain social harmony.
Then there was Yi, righteousness, the sense of what is right in a given situation, the ability to act appropriately without mere calculation of advantage. And Zhi, wisdom, the understanding that came from study and reflection. And Sin, trustworthiness, the quality of being reliable, of meaning what you say and following through on commitments. All of these virtues worked together to create the Junzi, the noble person, the person of moral cultivation. Originally, Junzi had simply meant son of a ruler, a term of birth status. Kongqiu transformed it into a term of moral achievement. Anyone could become a Junzi through effort and education. And conversely, someone born to privilege who failed to cultivate virtue was not truly noble. This was revolutionary thinking, though Kongqiu presented it as conservatism, as simply recovering what the ancients had known. But the ancients had not said that peasants could become noble through education, or that rituals should be available to all rather than reserved for the elite. His teaching was spreading, his influence growing. People began to speak of Master Kong, Kong Fuzi, as someone worth listening to, someone who understood the old ways but also spoke to contemporary problems. He was becoming known not just in Lu, but in surrounding states as a man of learning and principle. And yet, for all his success as a teacher, there was something missing. He was educating individuals, shaping their characters, preparing them to be good people, but he wanted to do more. He wanted to transform society itself, to see his principles implemented in government, to prove that virtue could indeed be the basis for political order. He was not content to be merely a private teacher, influential though that role was. He wanted to serve, to hold office, to demonstrate that a state governed according to ritual and benevolence would prosper more than a state governed by force and punishment. The opportunity to try, to put his theories into practice was approaching. Officials in Lu were beginning to take notice of this remarkable scholar. Positions might become available. He might finally have the chance to show that his vision was not just beautiful in theory, but workable in reality. His students must have felt both excitement and apprehension as their teacher prepared to enter the political arena. They had learned from him that the true scholar seeks to serve, that learning without application is incomplete. But they also knew how corrupt and brutal politics could be, how little the powerful cared for virtue and ritual when force served their interests better. Kongqiu himself must have felt the same mixture of hope and anxiety. He was in his late 40s now, no longer young, but not yet so old that he could not envision years of service ahead.
He had spent decades preparing, studying, teaching. Surely that preparation would prove valuable. Surely someone would give him the chance to try. The teacher was about to become a minister. The scholar was about to enter the world of power. It would not go as he hoped, but the attempt would teach him things that no amount of study could have revealed, and the disillusionment that followed would ultimately lead him to his greatest influence, not as a government official, but as something far more enduring, a moral voice that would echo through millennia, shaping countless lives long after every government of his era had crumbled to dust. But those lessons lay ahead. For now, in the early years of the 6th century BCE, Master Kong was still hopeful that wisdom could triumph over force, that virtue could be practical, that the ancient ways could heal the modern world. He was about to test that hope against the harsh realities of political life. The call came when Kong Chu was approaching 50 years old. After decades of study and teaching, after years of developing his vision of how society ought to be ordered, he was finally offered the chance to put his principles into practice. The state of Lu, like all the states of that fractured era, was a nest of competing powers. Nominally, the Duke of Lu ruled, but real authority had long since passed to three powerful families, the Meng son, the Shu son, and the Ji son, who divided the state among themselves like private fiefdoms. These families commanded their own armies, controlled their own territories, and treated the duke as little more than a ceremonial figurehead. It was the Ji son family that offered Kong Chu his first significant position. Ji Kongzi, the head of the family, was impressed by the scholar's reputation and perhaps saw value in having such a learned and principled man in his administration. Or perhaps he simply needed someone capable and honest to handle certain administrative duties. Kong Chu began with relatively modest appointments, overseeing public works in a district, managing local administration. These were not glamorous positions, but he approached them with characteristic seriousness. He had always believed that even small duties should be performed with integrity, that there was no task too humble to deserve one's full attention. As a local magistrate, he could implement some of his ideas on a small scale. He emphasized fair judgment, careful attention to the facts of cases, and punishment that fit the crime. He believed that people would naturally tend toward goodness if given the right example and proper instruction. Harsh laws and severe punishments, he thought, might compel outward compliance but would not transform character. Lead the people by laws and regulate them by penalties, he would later reflect, and the people will try to keep out of jail but will have no sense of shame. Lead them by virtue and restrain them by the rules of decorum, and the people will have a sense of shame and, moreover, will become good. His administration must have been a strange experience for those used to the typical corruption and brutality of local government. Here was an official who actually cared about fairness, who listened to both sides before rendering judgment, who could not be bribed, who treated even the lowliest petitioner with respect. Stories began to circulate about his judgments. Once, a father brought his son to Kong Chu, accusing the young man of unfilial behavior and demanding punishment. Kong Chu listened, questioned both father and son, and then had them both confined while he investigated. His advisors were puzzled. Why imprison the accuser? But Kong Chu understood that the problem was more complex than it appeared. If the son was unfilial, it was partly because the father had failed to teach him properly. 3 months later, having counseled both men, he released them, and the relationship was repaired. This was his approach, not to punish for punishment's sake, but to restore harmony, to educate rather than merely coerce. It was idealistic, perhaps, impractical on a large scale, but in his small jurisdiction, it seemed to work. His success brought promotion. By his early 50s, Kong Chu held the position of Minister of Crime, effectively the Chief Justice and Minister of Public Security for the state of Lu. It was a powerful position, one that allowed him to influence policy at the highest levels. He must have felt that his moment had finally come. Here was the opportunity he had spent his life preparing for, the chance to demonstrate that a state governed by virtue and ritual could indeed prosper, that the ancient principles were not just beautiful ideals, but practical guides for administration. He set about implementing reforms. He worked to reduce crime not primarily through harsher punishments, but through moral education and the ruler's good example. He emphasized the importance of ritual and propriety in government functions, believing that orderly ceremonies would cultivate orderly minds and habits.
Some of his reforms were quite practical. He strengthened Lu's defenses, organized the military more efficiently, improved public works. He was not so idealistic that he ignored practical necessities, but he tried to infuse everything with his principles: transparency, fairness, attention to the well-being of common people. There was a famous meeting during this period, a diplomatic encounter between Lu and the neighboring state of Qi. The two states were arranging a covenant, and Kong Qiu accompanied the Duke of Lu as his chief minister. The meeting was supposed to be peaceful, a ceremony of oath-taking, but the representatives of Qi had planned a trick. They brought armed performers who, at a signal, would threaten the Duke of Lu and force him to make humiliating concessions. But Kong Qiu saw through the deception. When the armed dancers approached, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the music and ceremony. "Our two rulers are meeting in friendship," he declared. "What need is there for these barbarian entertainments? Remove them." His moral authority and quickness were such that the Qi representatives, embarrassed, withdrew their performers. The treaty was concluded on equal terms, and Lu was not humiliated. Kong Qiu had protected his state's dignity not through military force, but through ritual propriety and moral clarity. It seemed like a vindication of everything he believed. Virtue could indeed be practical. Ritual had power. A principled minister could defend his state more effectively than armies. But the triumph was brief, and the reality of political power soon revealed itself in all its ugliness. Kong Qiu's very virtues made him dangerous to those whose power rested on corruption and force. He could not be bribed. He would not participate in the schemes and intrigues that were the daily currency of court politics. He insisted on proper procedures and fair treatment, even when it was inconvenient for the powerful. The three great families of Lu had tolerated him, even used him when his abilities served their purposes, but they had no intention of actually letting him implement his full vision. They did not want a state governed by virtue. They wanted a state they could control. Kong Qiu's talk of the duke's proper authority, of ritual propriety, of the need for ministers to serve rather than command, all of this threatened their position. Moreover, Kong Qiu made enemies through his very integrity. He pushed for the dismantling of the private fortifications that the three families maintained, the walled strongholds that allowed them to defy even the duke. A minister should not have a walled city, he argued. The fortifications were symbols and instruments of usurped power, violations of proper hierarchy. For a brief moment, it seemed he might succeed in this radical reform. One of the three families actually began to dismantle their walls, influenced perhaps by shame or momentary conviction. But the other families resisted, seeing clearly that without their fortifications, they would be vulnerable, their power diminished. And then there was the matter of Lu's growing strength and virtue, or at least its reputation for such. The neighboring state of Qi, watching Lu under Kong Qiu's influence become more orderly and potentially more powerful, grew concerned. A virtuous, well-governed Lu might become a threat. So Qi's ministers devised a plan, one that reveals the cynical brilliance with which the powerful manipulated the world. They sent to Lu a gift, 80 beautiful dancing girls and 30 teams of magnificent horses. It was a bribe, but wrapped in courtesy and generosity. The Duke of Lu and his chief minister, Ji Kongzi, were enchanted.
The performances went on for days, elaborate entertainments that distracted them from the business of government. Kong Qiu watched with growing dismay as the men he served abandoned their duties to watch dancers and admire horses. He tried to remonstrate, to remind them of their responsibilities, but they did not want to hear it. They wanted to enjoy their gift. They wanted pleasure and ease, not lectures about virtue and duty. Kong Qiu saw clearly what was happening. The gift was designed precisely to corrupt Lu's government, to distract its leaders, to undo the reforms he had worked so hard to implement. And it was working. Qi's ministers understood something that Kong Qiu's idealism sometimes blinded him to, that most people, even those who spoke of virtue, would choose comfort over principle when the choice was made easy enough. There came a point when the Duke and his ministers failed to perform the proper sacrifices at the appropriate time, distracted by their new entertainments. For Kong Qiu, this was the final proof that they were not serious about governance, that they had no real commitment to the principles they had allowed him to expound. The sacred rituals neglected, the duties of rulership abandoned for dancing girls. Everything he had tried to build, crumbling because those in power lacked the moral strength to resist temptation. He was 55 years old. He had devoted his life to learning, teaching, and preparing for this moment of service. He had finally achieved a position of real influence, and now he saw that it was futile. The rulers did not want virtue, they wanted power and pleasure. The ministers did not want harmony, they wanted advantage. The whole system was rotten, and no amount of individual integrity could fix it from within. He could have stayed, he could have compromised, played the game, kept his position and salary, told himself that he was doing some good, even if he could not do all the good he hoped. Many would have done so. The position of High Minister was prestigious and comfortable. His family would be provided for. He could continue teaching in his spare time. But Kong Qiu was not built for compromise on matters of principle. If he could not serve with integrity, he would not serve at all. If the rulers would not follow the way, he would not pretend that their rule was legitimate. And so, quietly but decisively, he resigned. He left the court of Lu, left the position he had worked toward his entire life, left the opportunity to wield real power and influence. He walked away from comfort and prestige because staying would have meant betraying everything he believed. His students must have been stunned. Some must have argued with him, urged him to stay, to work within the system, to accept that politics required compromise. But Kong Qiu had spent too many years thinking about these questions to waver now. He knew that some compromises preserve one's ability to do good, but others destroy the very principles one claims to serve. This was the latter kind. He left Lu not in anger or bitterness, but in sorrow. He had genuinely believed that his vision could work, that virtue could triumph, that the old ways could heal the new disorder. The failure was not just political, it was personal and philosophical. It challenged the very foundation of his teaching. If goodness could not succeed, even when given the chance, what did that mean? If rulers preferred dancing girls to duty, if power inevitably corrupted, if the way could not be walked in the real world, then what was the point of all his learning, all his teaching, all his devotion to ancient wisdom? These were dark questions, and they would haunt him through the years ahead. But he did not despair entirely. If Lu would not listen, perhaps another state would. If these rulers were too corrupted by luxury and ambition, perhaps somewhere there was a lord who genuinely wanted to govern well, who would welcome a minister committed to virtue. He was 55 years old, an age when most men sought rest and security. But Kong Qiu gathered his most devoted students and set out to find that ruler, that state, that opportunity to prove that the way was not just a beautiful dream, but a practical path. He was about to embark on the wandering years, a period of exile and searching that would last more than a decade, that would take him through multiple states, that would bring him close to death more than once, that would test his convictions and his endurance to their absolute limits. The teacher who had briefly become a minister was about to become a wanderer, a homeless sage carrying his wisdom from court to court, hoping against growing evidence that somewhere, someone would listen. The most difficult years of his life were beginning, and in those years of failure and frustration, he would paradoxically cement his legacy, because his students would see in his persistence despite disappointment the very virtues he had always taught: integrity, persistence, unwavering commitment to principle even when the world rejected it. The journey was about to begin. Let us follow him into exile.
The road stretched ahead, dusty and uncertain. Kong Chu, Master Kong, Confucius, 55 years old, his hair graying, his body no longer young, walked away from everything familiar. Behind him lay Lu, the state of his birth, the home he had known all his life. Behind him lay comfort, position, the possibility of ease in his declining years. Ahead lay only possibility and hope, increasingly fragile, that somewhere in the fractured landscape of warring states a ruler existed who would listen. He did not travel alone. Several of his most devoted students accompanied him, men who had absorbed his teachings so deeply that they could not imagine abandoning their master now, even if it meant hardship and uncertainty. Among them were Yan Hui, the gentle and brilliant student he loved most; Zilu, brave and impulsive; Zigong, clever and practical; and others whose names have echoed through history primarily because they chose to follow this stubborn idealist into exile. They traveled on foot mostly, occasionally in simple carts, carrying what belongings they needed and little more. Kong Chu brought his most precious possession, his knowledge, preserved in the texts he had studied and the principles he had refined over decades. These could not be taken from him, could not be lost to bandits or weather. They were written in his mind and heart. Their first destination was the state of Wei, which lay to the northwest of Lu. Wei was larger and more powerful than Lu, and its ruler, Duke Ling, had a reputation for cultural sophistication. Perhaps here, Kong Chu thought, he would find a more receptive audience. The journey itself was arduous. The roads were poor, little more than packed earth tracks that turned to mud in rain. Bandits haunted the routes between states, preying on travelers. The countryside showed everywhere the scars of constant warfare: burned villages, abandoned fields, refugees seeking safety. But Kong Chu and his students pressed on, and after weeks of travel they arrived in the Wei capital. Duke Ling received them with courtesy. He had heard of Master Kong's reputation, knew of his service in Lu, and was intrigued by this learned man who spoke of ancient wisdom and virtuous governance. For a time it seemed promising. The Duke granted Kong Chu a generous stipend, invited him to court, listened to his ideas. Kong Chu began to hope that perhaps Wei would be the place where his vision could finally be implemented. But he soon discovered that Duke Ling, for all his cultural interests, had no real intention of reforming his government according to Confucian principles. The Duke was more interested in Kong Chu as an ornament, a prestigious scholar whose presence lent intellectual credibility to the court. When it came to actual policy, how to wage war, how to extract resources from the people, how to maintain power, the Duke listened to his military advisors and political strategists, not to the aging moralist who spoke of ritual and virtue. Moreover, Duke Ling was dominated by his wife, Nan Zi, a woman of considerable intelligence and even greater ambition. She effectively controlled much of the state's policy, manipulating her husband and the court to maintain her influence. Kong Chu found himself in an impossible position. Nan Zi wanted to meet him, curious about this famous teacher. To refuse would be insulting and politically foolish, but to meet her seemed to compromise his principles. She represented everything wrong with Wei's government, the displacement of proper order by personal ambition and manipulation. He met her, briefly, maintaining strict propriety, but the encounter troubled him, and troubled his students even more. Zilu, blunt and protective, challenged his master. Why had he met with this woman of questionable virtue? Kong Chu, defensive and perhaps ashamed, swore an oath. "If I have done anything improper, may heaven reject me. May heaven reject me." It was a small incident, but it revealed the impossible tangles of political life, how even the most principled person could find themselves compromised simply by existing in a corrupt system. Kong Chu had not done anything truly wrong, but the appearance of impropriety haunted him. His own students doubted him. What did that say about the efficacy of his teaching? The situation in Wei became increasingly untenable. Duke Ling showed no signs of implementing reforms. The court was a nest of intrigue and manipulation. Kong Chu was comfortable but useless, a well-paid advisor whose advice was politely ignored. He left Wei, still searching. His small band of followers traveled to the state of Song, south of Wei. But Song proved even less hospitable. The chief minister, Huan Tui, took an immediate dislike to Kong Chu, perhaps seeing in his talk of virtue and proper governance an implicit criticism of his own rule. Stories say that Huan Tui even plotted to kill Kong Chu, that assassins were sent, that the master and his students barely escaped. Whether the danger was that dramatic or not, Song was clearly hostile territory. They moved on quickly, traveling east toward the states of Chen and Kai, smaller kingdoms that might be more receptive. The journey was taking its toll. These men were scholars, not warriors or merchants accustomed to hard travel. They slept in rough accommodations, ate simple food when they could get it, endured summer heat and winter cold. Kong Chu was no longer young. The physical demands of constant travel were exhausting. And yet he pressed on, driven by his conviction that somewhere, somehow, his message would find the right audience. In Chen, they found temporary refuge. The ruler was willing to host them, though again more out of curiosity and prestige than genuine interest in reform. Kong Chu and his students stayed for a time, and he taught any who would listen. But no position of real influence materialized. No opportunity arose to demonstrate that his principles could work in practice. They moved to Kai, then back to Chen, then to other small states, always searching, always hoping. The pattern repeated: initial welcome, polite interest, then gradual realization that no one actually wanted to implement his vision. The rulers wanted military strength, not moral authority. They wanted strategies for conquest, not lessons in ritual propriety. And yet, despite the repeated disappointments, Kong Chu's teaching continued and even flourished. The years of wandering became, paradoxically, some of his most productive as an educator. His students saw him not just as a teacher expounding theories in a comfortable school, but as a living example of his principles, someone who maintained integrity even when it cost him everything. They watched him refuse improper positions, turn down offers that would have been lucrative but morally compromising. They saw him maintain ritual propriety even in the most difficult circumstances, still bowing at the appropriate moments, still observing the proper forms, still treating every person with the respect their position and humanity deserved.
They listened as he refined his teaching, testing his ideas against the harsh realities they encountered. His philosophy was not becoming more pessimistic, exactly, but more nuanced, more aware of the difficulties involved in living virtuously in a corrupt world. "The gentleman stands in awe of three things," he told them one evening as they camped beside the road. "He stands in awe of the mandate of heaven, of great men, and of the words of the sages. The small man does not know the mandate of heaven and does not stand in awe of it. He is impudent toward great men and treats the words of the sages with levity." But he also acknowledged the loneliness of the virtuous path. "The wise are not confused, the benevolent are not worried, the brave are not afraid," he said. And yet he himself sometimes felt confused by the world's chaos, worried about his students' futures, afraid that his entire life's work might come to nothing. New students joined them during these wandering years, drawn by Kong Chu's growing reputation.
Word spread through the network of scholars and aspiring officials that Master Kong was traveling, teaching anyone who approached with sincerity. Some came from distant states, seeking him out specifically. Others encountered the group by chance and were drawn in by Kong Chu's obvious wisdom and his students' devotion. The group became a kind of mobile academy, a community of learning that traveled from state to state. They studied together, debated questions of morality and governance, practiced the rituals, sang the ancient songs. In their devotion to learning and virtue, they created a small island of order and cultivation in the midst of a chaotic world. Kong Chu taught them through both words and example. Once, when they were traveling through difficult terrain, the students complained about the hardship. Kong Chu reminded them, "It is not the failure of my doctrines that troubles me, but my failure to practice them better. It is not that I am unknown that troubles me, but that I am not capable enough to deserve to be known." He was turning his disappointments into teaching moments, showing his students that the true scholar did not blame others for his failures, but looked always to his own shortcomings, his own need for greater cultivation. But there were also moments of genuine joy and beauty. When they passed through a town with a temple, Kong Chu would perform the proper ceremonies, and his students would see how ritual could transform even a humble space into something sacred. When they camped for the night and Kong Chu played his qin, the music would carry across the darkness, a reminder that beauty and harmony still existed even in troubled times. He told them stories of the ancient sages, bringing those distant figures to life with such vividness that the students felt they were learning from multiple generations of wisdom. He analyzed the odes, showing how each poem contained layers of meaning, historical, moral, aesthetic. He explained the proper conduct of relationships between ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, friend, elder and younger. Let the ruler be a ruler, the minister a minister, the father a father, the son a son, he taught. This sounded simple, even tautological, but it contained profound meaning. Each person had a role, a set of responsibilities and privileges. When everyone fulfilled their role properly, society achieved harmony. The chaos of the present age came from people violating their roles, ministers usurping rulers, sons defying fathers, the strong oppressing the weak.
But returning to proper roles could not be accomplished through force alone. It required moral transformation, genuine cultivation of virtue. And that transformation had to begin with the individual, with each person looking to their own character before trying to change others. To put the world in order, we must first put the nation in order, he explained. To put the nation in order, we must first put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must cultivate our personal life. To cultivate our personal life, we must first set our hearts right. This was his fundamental insight, the core of what he offered to a world obsessed with military strategy and political maneuvering. Real change began within, with the transformation of individual character. A ruler who cultivated his own virtue would naturally govern well. A minister who set his own heart right would serve faithfully. A father who practiced benevolence would raise filial children. It seemed almost ridiculously idealistic, especially as they trudged from state to state, repeatedly rejected, sometimes endangered, always marginal to the political events that were shaping their world. What use was self-cultivation when armies were marching and kingdoms falling? What good was ritual when might made right? And yet, Kong Q persisted in his conviction. I transmit rather than create, he insisted. I believe in and love the ancients. He was not offering radical innovation, but recovery of ancient wisdom. The golden age of the early Zhou dynasty, when the sage kings ruled with virtue and the people lived in harmony, this was not myth, but history, he believed, and its principles could be recovered and applied. His students sometimes struggled with this. They lived in a world where innovation seemed necessary, where new strategies and ideas proliferated. And here was their master insisting that the answers lay in the past, in texts and rituals that most people had forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant. But they stayed with him, followed him from state to state, because they saw something in him that transcended practical success or failure. They saw integrity lived out, principle maintained regardless of cost, a human being who had genuinely transformed himself through learning and cultivation, and who offered that same transformation to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work. The wandering years were hard, yes, but they were also formative. The students were learning not just from Confucius' words, but from his life, from his persistence, from his refusal to compromise even when compromise would have been easy and profitable. And Confucius himself was being refined by these trials. The comfortable scholar who had served briefly in Lu's government was becoming something else, a sage tempered by suffering, a teacher whose authority came not from position, but from the depths of his character and the breadth of his wisdom. But the hardest trials still lay ahead. The years from 497 to 489 BCE had been difficult, marked by constant travel, repeated disappointment, and occasional danger. But they had not yet truly tested Confucius' resolve, had not pushed him to the absolute limits of his endurance and faith. Those tests were coming, in the form of a crisis that would nearly destroy him and his students, that would force him to confront the possibility that his entire life's work might be futile, that virtue might not be enough to sustain a person in a world governed by force and ambition. The darkest chapter of his wandering years was about to begin.
The crisis came without warning, though perhaps they should have seen it coming. Confucius and his students had been traveling between the states of Chen and Kai, moving through the border regions where authority was thin and danger common. They were heading toward the state of Chu, where Confucius had heard that the king might be receptive to his ideas, might offer him a real position with genuine authority. It was a hope like all the others, fragile and perhaps foolish, but hope was what kept them moving, kept them believing that somewhere, somehow, they would find the opportunity to demonstrate that virtue could indeed govern a state. The rulers of Chen and Kai heard of Confucius' plans, and they were alarmed. Chu was large and powerful, already a threat to the smaller states. If Chu's king took Confucius into his service, if this renowned teacher helped strengthen Chu's government and military, Chen and Kai would be in even greater danger. They could not allow it. And so they sent forces, not armies exactly, but armed men, enough to cut off Confucius' party, to prevent them from reaching Chu. The motives were purely political, coldly pragmatic. Confucius was not important enough to kill outright. That would create complications, perhaps offend other states. But he could be detained, delayed, discouraged from continuing his journey. Confucius and his students found themselves trapped in the wilderness between Chen and Kai. The armed men surrounded them at a distance, watching, waiting, making it clear that any attempt to continue toward Chu would be met with force. But they did not attack directly, did not make explicit threats. They simply held the scholars in place, like pieces on a game board that had become inconvenient. Days passed, then weeks. The situation became desperate. They had limited supplies when they were stopped, expecting to reach the next town within a day or two. Those supplies ran out quickly. They tried to forage, but the area was poor, already picked over by previous travelers and local villagers. They tried to hunt, but they were scholars, not hunters, and game was scarce in this contested border region that armies had marched through repeatedly. They began to starve. Not immediately, not dramatically. Hunger crept over them gradually, day by day, as their rations dwindled and then disappeared. First, they felt constant gnawing in their bellies, then weakness, a heaviness in their limbs, a difficulty in thinking clearly. Some fell ill, their bodies lacking the strength to fight off diseases that healthy men would have shrugged off easily.
Kong Chu was in his 60s now, an old man by the standards of that era. His body, already worn by years of travel and hardship, suffered acutely. He grew thin, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He spent much of his time resting, conserving what little strength he had. His students, younger and stronger, tried to shield him from the worst of it. They gave him larger portions of what food they managed to find, insisted he save his strength, but they were all weakening, all suffering. And as the physical suffering grew, so did the psychological torment. They were trapped, powerless, slowly dying in the wilderness because of political calculations that had nothing to do with them personally. They had committed no crime, they had harmed no one. They were simply caught in the machinations of states and rulers who saw them as potential problems to be neutralized.
Where was the justice in that? Where was the moral order Kong Qiu had spent his life teaching about? If heaven truly supported virtue, if the way was real and not just a beautiful fiction, then why were they suffering like this? Why was their master, the most virtuous man they knew, brought so low? The doubts, whispered at first, grew louder as the hunger intensified. Some students began to question whether they had made the right choice in following Kong Qiu. They had given up comfortable lives, prospects, families. For what? To die slowly in a forest because their teacher's idealism had made him politically inconvenient? Zilu, always the most direct of the students, finally confronted his master. He found Kong Qiu rusting under a tree, too weak to stand, but still maintaining his composure, still sitting with proper posture despite everything. Does even the superior man find himself in such desperate straits? Zilu asked, and the question contained all his frustration, his fear, his sense of betrayal. The superior man, the Junzi, the cultivated person, was supposed to have heaven's favor, was supposed to be protected by virtue. But here they were, starving, abandoned, seemingly punished for their very goodness. Kong Qiu looked at his student, brave, loyal Zilu who had followed him for years, who had protected him, who had never hesitated in his devotion. And Kong Qiu gave him an answer that cut through all the comfortable illusions. The superior man may indeed find himself in straits, he said quietly, but the small man, when in straits, loses all restraint. It was not the answer Zilu wanted. It offered no explanation for their suffering, no promise that virtue would be rewarded, no assurance that things would improve. Instead, it redefined what virtue meant. The superior man was not someone who never suffered, but someone who maintained dignity and principle even in suffering. The difference between the noble and the base was not in what happened to them, but in how they responded to what happened. This was a profound shift in Kong Qiu's teaching, or perhaps a clarification of what he had always meant but never stated so starkly. He had often spoken as if virtue would lead to success, as if the cultivated person would naturally flourish. Now he was acknowledging that virtue and suffering were not incompatible, that the good might indeed be brought low, that heaven's mandate was mysterious and not always visible in worldly outcomes. But if that was true, then why pursue virtue at all? If goodness brought no guarantee of reward, if the way did not protect its followers, then what was the point? The students wrestled with these questions as they struggled to survive. Yan He, the master's favorite, remained steadfast, never wavering in his devotion to learning and virtue. The master's way is supreme. That the world does not accept it is the world's shame, not the master's failing. But others were less certain. Zigong, practical and clever, began to wonder if they had been naive, if Kong Qiu's vision, however beautiful, was simply incompatible with the reality of political power. Perhaps the legalists were right. Perhaps only force and law could govern effectively. Perhaps ritual and virtue were luxuries for peaceful times, useless in an age of constant warfare. Kong Qiu knew his students were struggling. He could see it in their faces, hear it in the conversations they tried to hide from him. And he understood. He himself had moments of doubt, dark nights when he wondered if his entire life had been wasted chasing an impossible dream.
One day, when he had recovered enough strength to stand, he called his students together. His voice was weak but steady. He wanted to address their doubts directly, to test whether his teaching had truly taken root, or whether it had been merely intellectual assent that would collapse under real pressure. He asked them, each in turn, what they thought the problem was. Why were they suffering? Where had they gone wrong? Zilu, always blunt, suggested that perhaps they had not been virtuous enough, that if they had truly embodied the way, heaven would protect them. Zigong offered a more political answer. Perhaps the way was too elevated for this age. Perhaps they needed to lower their standards, make their teaching more acceptable to the rulers who actually existed, rather than the ideal rulers they hoped to find. But Yan Hui, thoughtful as always, said something different. Our way is great, and that is why the world cannot accept it. But Master, you should continue to promote it. What does it matter if people do not accept it? The very fact that it is not accepted shows that we are superior men. If the way were not cultivated, the shame would be ours, but we have cultivated it fully. If others do not use it, that is the shame of those in power. Kong Chu looked at Yan Hui with such love and approval that even in his weakened state his face seemed to brighten. Ah, son of Yan, if you were a rich man, I would be your steward. It was a moment of profound connection, of understanding passing between teacher and student. Yan Hui had grasped what Kong Chu had been trying to teach all along, that the value of virtue was inherent, not dependent on external recognition or reward, that the cultivated person pursued goodness for its own sake, not for what it would bring, that integrity meant maintaining one's principles precisely when doing so was costly, not just when it was convenient. This was the deeper wisdom that suffering was revealing. Kong Shu had always taught virtue, but perhaps he had sometimes implied that virtue would lead to success, that the good would prosper. Now, facing starvation and abandonment, he was discovering, or making explicit, a more profound truth, that virtue was its own justification, that the worth of a human life was not measured by political success or material comfort, but by the integrity with which it was lived. It was a cold comfort in the wilderness, with hunger gnawing at their bellies and death a real possibility, but it was real comfort nonetheless, a foundation that could not be shaken by external circumstances. And then, as mysteriously as it had begun, the crisis ended. Perhaps the rulers of Chen and Kai decided the scholars were no longer a threat. Perhaps word reached someone with influence who intervened. Perhaps Kong Chu's reputation was such that even hostile states were unwilling to be seen as causing his death. The historical sources do not tell us exactly what happened. What we know is that the blockade lifted. Kong Shu and his students were allowed to move on. They stumbled out of the wilderness, starving and exhausted, but alive. They made their way to the nearest town where they could finally eat, rest, recover their strength. The physical recovery took weeks. The psychological and spiritual impact would last far longer, for the rest of their lives, really. They had faced death, had confronted the possibility that their entire enterprise was futile, had seen their master reduced to weakness and hunger, and they had chosen, most of them, to remain loyal, to hold to the principles they had been taught, even when those principles seemed to offer nothing but suffering. Kong Qiu himself emerged from the ordeal transformed. Not in his basic convictions, he still believed in virtue, ritual, education, all the principles he had always taught, but he understood them now at a deeper level. He understood that the way was not a path to worldly success, but a path to human dignity and meaning regardless of worldly success. He understood that teaching was not about training future ministers and officials, but about forming human beings who could maintain their integrity in any circumstances. "Heaven produced the virtue that is in me," he reflected later. "What can man do to me?" It was an expression of profound faith, not in guaranteed protection, but in the ultimate meaning of virtue regardless of outcomes. The crisis between Chen and Kai became legendary among his followers, a story told and retold to illustrate the master's perseverance and the depth of his teaching. It was the moment when the philosophy was tested against ultimate adversity and proved itself, not by preventing suffering, but by providing meaning within suffering. As they recovered and continued their travels, the students noticed changes in their master. He was more reflective, perhaps, more willing to acknowledge the difficulties and contradictions of life. He spoke less about the certainty that virtue would triumph, and more about the necessity of pursuing virtue regardless of whether it triumphed. "If my way is not to prevail, I know it," he said once, with a kind of sad resignation. "But shall I therefore not pursue it? If I find the world unreceptive, is that reason to abandon the good?" He told them that the true scholar, the genuine Junzi, did not depend on external circumstances for validation. The determined scholar and the man of virtue will not seek to live at the expense of injuring their virtue. They will even sacrifice their lives to preserve their virtue complete. This was a sterner teaching than he had sometimes offered in easier days. It demanded everything. It promised nothing but the integrity of the commitment itself. And yet his students found it compelling, even beautiful, because they had seen it lived out in their master's conduct during the crisis. They had seen Confucius maintain his dignity when he could barely stand. They had seen him continue to observe ritual proprieties even when starving. They had refused to blame heaven or become bitter, instead turning the experience into teaching, into an opportunity for deeper understanding. If the way could sustain a person through that, then perhaps it was worth following, even if it never led to political success, wealth, or recognition. The trial in the wilderness became a kind of initiation, a shared ordeal that bound the inner circle of students to their master and to each other with chains stronger than any success could have forged. They had chosen virtue over survival, or rather, they had chosen a kind of survival that depended on maintaining virtue, even at the risk of physical death. It was the heart of Confucius' teaching, distilled and purified by suffering. And it would be this teaching, this willingness to maintain principle regardless of cost, that would eventually make his philosophy so powerful and enduring. Because while governments rise and fall, while success and failure alternate, the question of how to live with integrity in difficult circumstances remains perpetually relevant. They moved on from the wilderness, continuing their wanderings, but they were different now. They had been tested and had not broken. They had faced the worst and discovered that the way could sustain them even there. Confucius was growing old. His body had been damaged by the starvation and would never fully recover. He knew that time was running short, that his years of wandering could not continue indefinitely. And he was beginning to suspect that he would never find the ruler he sought, that his political dreams would remain unfulfilled. But he also knew, more clearly than ever, that his life had not been wasted. He had students who understood his teaching at its deepest level. He had demonstrated that virtue was real and achievable even in the hardest circumstances. He had preserved and transmitted wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. It was not the legacy he had hoped for, perhaps, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Soon the call would come to return home to Lu, and in his final years, freed from the demands of travel and political aspiration, he would do his greatest work, not as a minister or advisor, but as a teacher and scholar, shaping the minds and hearts of students who would carry his vision forward long after his death. But that homecoming still lay ahead. For now, in the aftermath of the wilderness trial, Kung Q and his students continued their journey, tempered by suffering, deepened by doubt overcome, more certain than ever that the way, though hard, was worth walking.
The invitation arrived in the 14th year of Kong Q's wandering, when he was 68 years old. It came from Lu, from the state he had left so long ago in disappointment and principle. The chief minister, Ji Kongzi, part of the same family that had failed him before, was requesting his return. It was not what Kong Q had hoped for. There was no promise of high office, no commitment to implement his reforms, no suggestion that Lu had suddenly embraced virtue over pragmatism. The invitation was more modest, more honest in its way. They wanted him back as an elder statesman, a respected teacher, a symbol of cultural cultivation. They would honor him, support him, give him a place of dignity, but they would not give him power. Kong Q must have felt the bitter irony. After all these years of searching for a ruler who would listen, the only state willing to take him back was the one he had left, and they wanted him precisely because he was now old and no longer a threat to their arrangements. They could afford to be generous to a man who posed no danger to their political games. He could have refused. He could have seen the offer for what it was, charity wrapped in respect, a comfortable exile disguised as honor. He could have insisted on continuing his search, holding out for the ideal opportunity that had eluded him for 14 years. But Kong Q was tired. The years of travel had worn his body down. The crisis between Chen and Chai had damaged his health in ways that time could not fully repair. He was no longer young enough to endure the hardships of the road, the uncertainty of constant movement, the disappointment of repeated rejection. More importantly, he had learned something during these years of wandering. He had learned that political power was not the only way, perhaps not even the best way, to change the world. He had students now, dozens of them, men whose characters he had shaped, whose minds he had formed. Through them, his teaching would spread far more effectively than through any government policy he might have implemented. And so, in 484 BCE, Kong Q came home. The journey back to Lu must have stirred complicated emotions. He was traveling the same roads he had taken 14 years earlier, but in reverse, moving toward familiarity rather than away from it. The landscape was the same, yet he was profoundly changed. The man who had left at 55, still vigorous, still hopeful that his vision could transform a state, was returning at 68, weakened, wiser, his hopes chastened, but his convictions intact. His students accompanied him, those who had endured the wandering years at his side. They must have wondered what awaited them in Lu. Would their master be given the respect he deserved? Would his final years be peaceful, or would the same political intrigues that had driven him away reassert themselves? Khufu welcomed him with ceremony and honor. Ji Kongzi received him respectfully, provided him with a comfortable residence and a generous stipend. The Duke acknowledged his return with gifts and courtesy. Kong Q was given the deference due to a great scholar and teacher, if not the authority of a minister. It was enough, perhaps more than enough. Kong Q settled into his home and turned his full attention to the work that would define his final years. If he could not reform governments directly, he would do something more lasting. He would preserve and transmit the ancient wisdom for future generations. He would teach with renewed dedication. He would edit and compile the texts that contained the knowledge of the sages. His residence became an academy, though not in any formal sense. Students came, some who had followed him through the years of wandering, others who were young men of Lu seeking to learn from the famous returned master, still others who traveled from distant states having heard of his reputation. He welcomed them all, as he always had, asking only for sincerity and commitment. His teaching now had a different quality than in his younger years. It was deeper, tempered by experience and suffering. He had seen the worst that the world could offer. He had been humiliated, endangered, starved, rejected, and through it all, he had maintained his principles. This was not abstract philosophy anymore. It was wisdom earned through lived experience. He spoke often now about acceptance, about understanding one's limitations while maintaining one's commitments. At 15, I set my heart on learning, he reflected, looking back over his life. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no more doubts. At 50, I understood the will of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing what was right. It was a map of moral and spiritual development charted through his own journey. The final stage, following one's heart's desire without transgressing, this was the goal. To become so thoroughly cultivated that virtue became natural, effortless, the spontaneous expression of one's character rather than a constant struggle against baser impulses. He had not fully achieved it, he knew. He was 68, not yet 70, but he was approaching it, could sense it as a possibility, a state where duty and desire aligned completely. But there was also sadness in these reflections, a sense of time running short and work unfinished. "The phoenix does not come," he said once, referring to the mythical bird whose appearance was supposed to herald an age of virtue and good government. "The river chart is not sent forth." These were omens that had appeared for the ancient sages, signs that heaven approved of their rule. But in Confucius' time, no such signs appeared. Heaven was silent, or at least not speaking in ways that people could understand. "It is all over with me," he concluded with resignation. He would not live to see the golden age restored. The world would continue in its chaos and violence. But he could still preserve what mattered, could still pass on the wisdom that might, someday, help create a better world. He turned his energy to the texts, the ancient documents and records that contained the knowledge of past ages. The Book of Odes, 300 poems and songs that had been used in education and ceremony. The Book of Documents, historical records of the ancient sage kings. The Book of Rites, detailing the proper forms for all occasions. The Spring and Autumn Annals, the chronicle of Lu's history. Confucius edited these works, selecting what was most valuable, arranging them in coherent order, adding commentary where needed to clarify meaning. He was not creating new material. "I transmit, I do not create," he insisted. But transmission required curation, required judgment about what deserved preservation and what could be allowed to fade.
This work was painstaking, demanding complete concentration and deep knowledge. Each character had to be copied carefully. There was no printing, only handwritten manuscripts that would themselves be copied by students and scholars in future generations. Each section had to be arranged thoughtfully so that the flow of material would aid understanding. Each historical reference needed context so that future readers would grasp its significance. His students assisted him, learning not just the content, but the methods of textual scholarship. They debated the meaning of obscure passages, discussed which variants of texts were most reliable, explored the historical contexts that made sense of ancient references. This might seem dry work compared to political reform or dramatic teaching moments, but Confucius understood its importance. These texts were the repository of ancient wisdom. If they were lost or corrupted, future generations would have no access to the knowledge of the sages. By preserving them carefully, by transmitting them accurately, he was ensuring that his work would outlast any political achievement. He also worked on the Spring and Autumn Annals with particular care. This was the historical chronicle of Lu, and Confucius edited it with a specific purpose: to teach moral lessons through the careful choice of language in describing historical events. When a minister assassinated his lord, Confucius would describe it in ways that made the moral horror clear. When a ruler acted virtuously, the language would reflect approval. The annals became not just a record of facts, but a moral education, teaching readers to distinguish right from wrong through the accumulated examples of history.
"The spring and autumn annals will make men know me," he said, "and it will make men condemn me." He knew that his moral judgments would be controversial, that some would disagree with his interpretations of events. But he also knew that grappling with these judgments would force readers to think deeply about ethics and governance, which was precisely the point. Between teaching and editing, his days were full. He rose early, observed the proper rituals, then spent hours working with texts or instructing students. He maintained the daily practices that had structured his entire life, the ritual proprieties, the music, the careful attention to conduct that expressed and cultivated virtue. His health was declining. The starvation between Chen and Kai had weakened him permanently. He tired more easily now, needed more rest. Sometimes his mind was as sharp as ever, perceiving connections and meanings that students half his age missed. Other times he struggled to focus, felt the weight of his years. But he persisted. There was still so much to do, so much knowledge to transmit, so many students to teach. He could not afford to slow down, not when time was clearly running short. New students continued to arrive, drawn by his reputation. Some became close to him in these final years, though none would replace the intimacy he had with his oldest disciples, like Yan Hui and Zilu. But he gave each student what they needed, tailoring his teaching to their particular characters and capacities. To one student, he might emphasize caution and careful thought if the student was impulsive. To another, he might stress the need for action and courage if the student was overly cautious. He knew that moral cultivation was not one size fits all, that each person had different weaknesses to overcome and different strengths to develop. He also spent time with his own family, though we know little about these relationships. His son, Li, was an adult now, and Kang Qiu had not been an especially attentive father. His work had always consumed him. But there was respect between them, if not great warmth. His wife, from whom we hear nothing directly, had maintained the household through all the difficult years. His daughters had married, their lives unfolding in the ways considered proper for women of their time and class.
Kang Qiu had sacrificed much of his family life for his vocation. It was a cost he had paid knowingly, but not without regret. He taught about the importance of filial piety, of proper family relationships, of the home as the foundation of social order. But he had himself been often absent, pursuing his larger mission of transforming society through education. This was one of the contradictions of his life, one of the ways he fell short of his own ideals. He acknowledged it implicitly when he said, "I have yet to meet a man who loves virtue as much as he loves beauty." Even he, with all his cultivation, was not perfect. The gap between aspiration and achievement remained. But in these final years at home in Lu, he was more at peace than he had been in decades. The political frustrations that had driven him to wander were behind him. The constant uncertainty and danger of travel were over. He was home, surrounded by students who loved and respected him, engaged in work that would outlast his lifetime. On quiet evenings, he would play his qin, the music drifting through the courtyard where students gathered. Or he would sing the old songs from the Book of Odes, his voice cracked with age, but still carrying the melodies that connected him to ancient times. The students would listen, and in those moments the gap between past and present seemed to dissolve. The wisdom of the sages felt immediate and alive, transmitted not just through written characters, but through music and presence. "How sublime was the virtue of Shun," he would say, speaking of the ancient sage king. "He ruled by non-action. He simply placed himself gravely and reverently with his face due south, and that was all. It was his ideal of governance. The rulers so virtuous that order emerged naturally from his example, without need for elaborate laws or harsh punishments." He knew that such governance was not possible in the present age, knew that his political dreams would remain unfulfilled. But in teaching, in preserving the texts, in forming the characters of his students, he was doing something equally important.
He was keeping alive the possibility of that better world, ensuring that when conditions changed, when a true sage king finally appeared, the knowledge of how to govern virtuously would still exist. It was not the active reform he had once hoped to lead, but it was vital work nonetheless, and he approached it with all the dedication and care he had brought to his brief time in government. The years passed quietly, peacefully, productively. Confucius was preparing his legacy, though he did not think of it in those terms. He was simply doing what needed to be done, transmitting what needed to be transmitted, teaching what needed to be taught. But time was running out faster than he knew. The sorrows and losses of old age were approaching, griefs that would shake him more profoundly than political disappointment ever had. The peaceful days in Lu would not last much longer. The final trials were coming, not political or physical this time, but personal. The unbearable pain of watching those he loved most depart before him.
The losses began with his son, Li, whose name meant carp, the child born when the Duke of Lu had sent that auspicious gift so many decades ago, died suddenly in his early 50s. The historical record tells us almost nothing about him, not his character, not his accomplishments, not even the cause of his death. He exists in history primarily as Confucius' son, a shadow figure defined by his father's fame. But to Confucius, he was not a shadow. He was the child he had held as an infant, the boy he had taught, the man who carried the family line forward. And now he was gone, dying before his father, violating the natural order that said parents should depart first. Confucius grieved, but with restraint. He had taught all his life about proper mourning, about the rituals that channeled grief into socially productive forms. He performed those rituals now for his son, maintaining the composure expected of a sage, even as his heart broke. The students watched their master weep with dignity, expressing sorrow without losing himself to it, and they saw in his grief another lesson about being human while remaining noble. "A father does not grieve for his son without limit," he said quietly, explaining his restraint to students who perhaps expected more dramatic displays. But inside, the loss cut deep. Li had been unremarkable, perhaps, not a brilliant student or accomplished scholar like so many of Confucius' disciples, but he had been his son, the continuation of the family, and now that line felt more fragile, more uncertain. The grief was still fresh when the second blow fell, and this one nearly destroyed him. Yan Hui died. Yan Hui, called Yan Wan, the beloved student whom Confucius had praised above all others. Yan Hui, who lived in poverty with a bowl of rice and a gourd of water, yet remained cheerful and devoted to learning. Yan Hui, who had understood the teaching at its deepest level, who had never wavered during the crisis between Chen and Kai, who embodied everything Confucius believed about the transformative power of moral cultivation. He was only in his 30s when death took him. Illness, probably, the kind of sickness that claimed so many in that era, that struck without warning and could not be fought. One day he was there, studying and learning, full of promise. The next he was sick, and then, with terrible swiftness, he was gone. When Confucius received the news, his composure shattered. He wept openly, uncontrollably, crying out in anguish, "Heaven is destroying me! Heaven is destroying me!" His students, alarmed by this unprecedented display of emotion, tried to comfort him, tried to remind him of his own teachings about accepting fate, about maintaining dignity in sorrow. "Master," they said gently, "you are grieving excessively." He turned on them, his face wet with tears, his voice breaking. "Am I grieving excessively? If I do not grieve excessively for this man, for whom should I grieve?" It was not just the loss of a beloved student, though that would have been grief enough. It was the loss of his hope. Yan Hui had been proof that the teaching worked,
that virtue could be cultivated to such perfection that human beings could become truly noble regardless of birth or circumstance. Yan Hui had been the one who would carry the tradition forward, who would become the next great teacher, who would spread the wisdom Kong Chu had spent his life preserving and refining. Now that hope was gone. Yan Hui's potential would never be realized. All that brilliance, all that virtue, snuffed out while lesser men continued to live and prosper. Where was the justice? Where was heaven's order? Kong Chu had taught that the virtuous were aligned with the way, that they fulfilled heaven's mandate, but Yan Hui had died young while corrupt ministers grew old in their luxury. The world made no sense. "There is no one who truly understands me," Kong Chu lamented in his grief. Yan Hui had understood, had grasped not just the words but the spirit of the teaching, and now he was gone, and Kong Chu felt more alone than he had even in the wilderness between Chen and Kai. Yan Hui's father, himself one of Kong Chu's students, came to the master with a request. He wanted Kong Chu's carriage, the master still kept one, a necessity for an elderly man of his status, to sell so that he could afford an outer coffin for his son. The inner coffin would be simple, but with the proceeds from the carriage, they could provide the elaborate outer coffin that befitted Yan Hui's status as a distinguished scholar. Kong Chu refused, gently but firmly. "Whether talented or not, everyone speaks of his own son," he said. "When my own son, Li, died, he had an inner coffin but no outer one. I did not go on foot in order to provide one. I could not do so because I am ranked just below the ministers. It would not be proper for me to go on foot." It was a decision that must have cost him, but it showed his unwavering commitment to propriety even in grief. He could not violate ritual correctness, could not step outside his proper station even for Yan Hui. The form had to be maintained, because the forms were what held society together, what separated civilization from chaos. To abandon them, even for the best reasons, would be to betray everything he had taught. The students arranged Yan Hui's funeral with what resources they had, and Kong Chu attended, his grief still raw but now contained within proper ritual forms. He spoke of Yan Hui's virtues, his dedication to learning, his gentleness of character. He called him "my friend," an extraordinary term from a teacher, expressing an intimacy and equality that transcended the usual student-teacher relationship. After Yan Hui's death, Kong Chu seemed to age rapidly. The vitality that had sustained him through years of wandering and hardship began to fade. He was 71 now, very old by the standards of his time. His body was failing, worn out by decades of travel, damaged by starvation and deprivation, weakened by grief. He still taught when he had the strength, still worked on the texts when his mind was clear, but the periods of vigor grew shorter, the times of exhaustion longer. He spent more time resting, sitting quietly in his courtyard, watching the seasons change, feeling his life drawing to its close. His remaining students watched with growing concern and sorrow. They knew they were losing him, that their time with the master was measured now in weeks or months, not years. They treasured every conversation, every teaching, every moment of his presence.
One morning, Kong Chu rose before dawn, as was his habit. But instead of his usual routine, he walked slowly outside, leaning on his staff, and began to pace in front of his door, singing softly to himself. The great mountain must crumble, the strong beam must break, and the wise man wither away like a plant. Zigong, one of his longtime students, heard the song and came quickly, alarmed by the melancholy in his master's voice. He found Kong Chu standing there, tears streaming down his face. "The world has long been without the way," Kong Chu said. "No one has been able to follow me. The men of Xia used to place the coffin on the eastern steps. The men of Zhou place it on the western steps. The men of Yin place it between the two pillars. Last night, I dreamed that I was sitting between two pillars with offerings before me, as the men of Yin would do. I am a man of Yin. I know what this dream means."
He went back inside, lay down on his bed, and did not rise again. For 7 days he lingered, growing weaker. His students took turns sitting with him, keeping vigil, hoping he might recover, but knowing in their hearts that the end was near. Sometimes he was lucid, speaking clearly, offering final words of wisdom or comfort. Other times he drifted, his mind wandering between past and present, between memory and dream. Zilu came to see him, the brave, impulsive student who had followed him through all the wandering years. Kongshu looked at him with affection and sadness. "Zilu, you have been with me so long. Please, after I am gone, continue to study and practice the way. Do not let what we have worked for be forgotten." To Zigong and the other students gathered around his bed, he spoke of legacy and continuity. "I am not concerned that I have no position. I am concerned to be worthy of having one. I am not concerned that people do not know me. I seek to be worth knowing. Continue in this spirit. Teach what I have taught. Preserve what I have preserved. Let the wisdom of the ancients continue to live." He spoke about his life with a kind of peaceful acceptance. He had not achieved what he hoped. He had not found the ruler who would implement his vision, had not seen virtue triumph in the political realm, had not restored the golden age of the ancient sages. By the measures of worldly success, his life could be counted a failure. But he had done what he could. He had preserved the knowledge. He had taught students who would carry the tradition forward. He had demonstrated that virtue could be maintained even in the worst circumstances. He had shown that learning and moral cultivation were available to anyone willing to make the effort. "I do not know what I have accomplished," he said quietly, "but I have tried to be true to what I believed. I have tried to transmit what deserved transmission. Heaven knows whether I have succeeded."
As death approached, Kong-Q maintained his characteristic attention to propriety. Even in weakness, he arranged himself properly on his bed, his head oriented correctly according to ritual prescription. Even dying, he would die according to form, demonstrating to the last that ritual was not empty gesture, but the structure that gave human life dignity and meaning. On the 11th day of the 4th month in 479 BCE, in the early morning, Kong-Q, Master Kong, Confucius, died. He was 72 years old, though some sources say 73, depending on how they counted the years. His students were devastated. They had lost not just a teacher, but a father figure, a moral compass, the center around which their lives had been organized. What would they do without him? How could they continue without his guidance? They buried him with all the ceremony they could afford, north of the capital of Lu, in a place that would become sacred ground. They observed the traditional 3 years of mourning, actually 27 months, living simply, abstaining from music and pleasure, dedicating themselves to grief and remembrance. Some of the students built huts near his grave and stayed there for the entire mourning period, keeping vigil over their master even in death. Zigong, devoted to the end, remained for 6 years, unable to tear himself away, finding in the rituals of mourning a way to express the depth of his loss. They had lost their master, but what he had given them could not be lost. The teaching, the example, the vision of human possibility that he had spent his life articulating and embodying. They would carry it forward, would teach it to others, would preserve the texts he had edited, would tell stories of his life and wisdom. Kong-Q had died believing himself largely a failure, unknown beyond a circle of students, his political dreams unrealized, his vision rejected by the powers of his age. He could not have imagined that within a few generations his teaching would spread throughout China. He could not have known that his disciples would compile his sayings into a text, the Analects, that would be studied for thousands of years. He could not have foreseen that emperors would honor him, that temples would be built in his name, that his philosophy would shape entire civilizations. He died as he had lived,
faithful to his principles, committed to his vision, maintaining dignity and propriety to the very end. He died without certainty that his work had mattered, without proof that virtue would ultimately triumph, without seeing the world transformed as he had hoped. But he died having lived a fully human life, not a life free from failure or sorrow, not a life of unbroken success or recognition, but a life of integrity and meaning, a life devoted to something larger than himself, a life that demonstrated what human beings could become through learning and moral cultivation. The wise man had withered like a plant, as his song predicted. The great mountain had crumbled. The strong beam had broken. But the teaching remained. The wisdom endured. The students would carry it forward. And though Confucius could not have known it as he drew his final breath, his voice would echo through millennia, speaking to billions of people, shaping how humanity understood virtue, education, family, governance, and the possibility of moral transformation. The mortal man had died, but the sage, the teacher whose vision transcended his time and place, was only beginning his true work. The legacy that would make him immortal was just taking shape in the hearts and minds of the students who wept beside his grave.